Our next speaker comes to us from California. And I'm not from California, and I was wondering how we would pronounce his name, because I thought his name looked like Mark Randazzo, or Randazzo. I asked Mark how you pronounce his name, and he said, Mark Randazzo. So we're going to hear from Mark shortly. Mark has worked to support social justice for more than 30 years with organisations including the Peace Corps, Save the Children Federation, Oxfam America, and United Support of Artists for Africa. And then in 2012, he helped to found the EDGE Funders Alliance, of which he is now director. The EDGE Funders Alliance works within philanthropy to raise awareness and to deepen understanding of the interconnectedness of the social, economic and technological crises threatening our future, looking to support change that will transition us to a society that supports justice, equity and the well-being of the planet. And it's on that topic that Mark is going to talk to us this morning. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome from San Francisco, California, Mark Randazzo.
That was a valiant effort. It wasn't even close, the way he pronounced my name, but that's okay. My name is Mark Randazzo. I lived in San Francisco, California for 20 years, but moved recently to what I will graciously say is the second most livable and beautiful city in the world, Marseille, France. So I currently live in France. Good morning, everyone. I'm very, very happy to be here. I've lived in many parts of the world for more than half of my life, but I've actually never been to this part of the world before, so I'm very, very happy to be here. And I'd really like to extend my sincere thanks to Tony, Yvonne, and the others with Philanthropy New Zealand, but also to Amanda, Ione, Esther with the Australian Grantmakers Network, Environmental Grantmakers Network that I met with last week, and also with Lourdes and the International Funders for Indigenous Peoples that I was with at their hui a few days ago. It's my first time in the region, as I said, and I've been really learning a lot from my conversations here. And I've been greatly impressed, among other things, by the culture here of forward thinking within Maori communities and beyond, of looking back to understand from where we've come, but also looking forward to understand where we need to go. You even have one of your investment banker sponsors who talks about tomorrow, be tomorrow, make tomorrow today. So that's what I want to talk about. The need for us all to have a long-term vision of the kind of societies we want to build and the kind of communities we want to live in. And those ideas are what are at the heart of my talk today. So first, I'd like to just tell you a little bit more about EDGE Funders Alliance and explain some of the ways we approach these issues of, as the title says, resourcing change for a world in transition. And I want to start with a shared premise, what I assume is a shared premise. I think we all understand that over the coming decades, our economies and our societies will undergo profound change, and that this change is inevitable. Whether we do anything about it or not, we're in for some great changes. We heard yesterday from Katie Love about Wikipedia and the transformational ways that it is changing the nature of information and knowledge exchange, and that's just one very small example of all of the changes underfoot. Economists like some of you may know, thinkers like Jeremy Rifkin, argue that the technology revolution, the Internet of Things, will bring over the coming decades marginal costs down to near zero, transforming us beyond this late stage of capitalism that we're in, and optimistically moving us towards what he calls a collaborative commons. Whether or not people like Rifkin are right, I think most of us in this room would agree that immense systemic challenges face humanity, and that they require deep and transformation of how we live together on this planet. So, one thing we can say with certainty is that a transition over the decades to come is inevitable. The question before us is whether that transition will be a positive one or not. And if it's true that transition is inevitable, it's likely true that a just transition will need to be worked for. And it seems to be the case that if we here in philanthropy are able to contribute in positive ways to deep and positive systems change, then we must move from transactional to more transformational approaches in our grant making. And that's what I will talk about. I think everyone would agree that we need to move beyond transactional grant making only, that is traditional, time-limited, project-based, measurable in a short-term way, towards approaches that are more systemic, more collaborative, that have an eye towards long-term change. Most importantly, we need to be thinking about the root causes of the crises faced by humanity. And I don't think anybody in this room would disagree with that. So let me just now pause for a moment to tell you a little bit about EDGE. We are a network of close to 90 foundations, mainly based in the US and in Europe, although we have a few partners in Latin America and Africa. We do not have any members at this point in New Zealand or Australia, so I hope that might change. And we're made up, as you can see from our board of directors, of large foundations like Ford and Rockefeller and Open Society Foundations and others, smaller family foundations like the Christensen Fund or the Wallace Global Fund, and re-granting organizations like the Urgent Action Fund or Red Umbrella that Katie talked about yesterday. This is our mission, but the way I like to describe EDGE more succinctly is that EDGE is a space for funders across a whole array of issues that basically are supporting what I characterize as necessary fights for more equity, more justice, more sustainability within the system as it is, but are thinking about the deeper systemic changes that we know that we really need. We organize an annual conference. Our most recent conference was held just 2 weeks ago in Barcelona, and over the last few years and few conferences, we've been talking about issues around just transition and around systemic change. You can see that this was the conference this year, Reorganizing Power for Systems Change. And I'll talk a little bit more about this framing in a minute. One of the other important characteristics I should mention about EDGE funders is that it not only brings together an array of funders and foundations and donors from different kinds of grant-making institutions, but we have a kind of a slogan, informal slogan. We say that EDGE is a space for funders, but with movements. And what that simply means is that we do a lot of our work together with civil society leaders, community-based organization leaders, networks, and social movements. So at our conference in Barcelona, for example, it was much smaller than this, but we had about 250 participants over the 3 days, and there were probably around 170 funders and donors and people within philanthropy, but we had 70 or more movement partners, as we call them, integrated into all aspects of our work. So that aspect of being for funders with movements is important for us. And it's important also because we not only work closely with different movements around the world, but we also derive our understanding of the challenges we face and how to address them from these very diverse networks, thinkers, and movement partners. For example, we work, especially in Europe, with groups involved in commoning, maker spaces, and fab labs that are developing new kinds of collaboratives. We work, funders within the EDGE Alliance work on gender justice and intersectionality with groups like the World March of Women and AWID that some of you may know. We incorporate notions of rights of nature, buen vivir, kind of better, not more, not being obsessed with more and more growth from indigenous communities in the Andes. We work with groups in La Via Campesina and indigenous groups and landless farmers around the world around food sovereignty. All of these things help us build the work that we do together. I'm going to now just show a brief 2-minute film to let some of the funders in the network give you a better, clearer example of our work and what EDGE Funders is all about.
The greatest task philanthropy has is not simply to give to what exists, but to reimagine what is possible.
Foundations, philanthropy, donors need to be thinking about how do we basically make ourselves not necessary in 20 or 30 years because we're trying to fix the problems and not just ameliorate them.
It's almost common sense by now that we do need some sort of change. It can't go on like this.
We could be supplying immediate solutions, the Band-Aids, forever.
You can't address environment without addressing economy. You can't address economy without addressing race and poverty.
We need to understand that the struggle to address global poverty and the struggle to address environmental injustice and to prevent catastrophic climate change can and should and must be seen as two sides of the same coin.
What we're trying to do with EDGE funders is to get people on the edge of that comfort zone of thinking about the relationship between the here and now and the local and the long-term vision of a global transformation.
It's rare that we have time just to reflect on the impact of what we're doing or frame it in any way.
What does a prosperous society really look like?
How do we govern differently?
How do you have economic growth that's not accompanied by inequality?
We all need space for the big questions to be asked and answered.
EDGE Funders provides a very critical space to have those kinds of questions and that analysis.
The most important kind of philanthropy has to, in my mind, be systemic, seek transformative change, and find those projects, those groups, those ideas which will build toward that kind of change.
If you are not on the edge, you're taking too much space.
I love that little line from Akwasi at the end there. We had that on our mugs that we gave away at our conference 2 years ago. When I said before that we derive a lot of our thinking from different movements around the world, there's a group of grassroots organizations based in communities of color, indigenous communities, white working class communities in the United States that have organized together over recent years. They formed as the Climate Justice Alliance, and their kind of tagline is communities organized for a just transition. And they've developed some very interesting ways of approaching these issues of just transition and systemic change that we use also, and that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about now. What you see here was the framing for our conference last year. Rethink, resist, restructure to build anew is one way we like to think of this work. And one of the things that, and what's nice about this, and I'll come back to this a little bit towards the end, is that it doesn't mean for us that all movements and certainly all funders have to be doing all aspects of this, but that being conscious that in our efforts to change the rules, to work on governance, to change the story, to think about narratives, as we talked about in the lab or in the workshop yesterday, of resisting enclosure and all of the different ways to build new systemic alternatives, having a good sense of how they all interrelate, seeing them as a whole, even if you're working on one part of that, can be really important. One of the anchor organizations based in Oakland, California of the Climate Justice Alliance is called Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project, and they've got a really, really nice way of talking about all of this. They, first of all, start with the notion of eco, the word eco from the Greek oikos, just meaning home. And if you start with that notion that eco means home, then you can quickly understand that ecology is simply the knowledge of home. Ecosystems are all the interrelated relationships of home. And so then when we come to economy, we really can just take a step back and think of economy as the management of home. And for me, it was really kind of just enlightening and thought-provoking a couple of years ago when we first were talking with them about this, to just take that step back and just realize that when we talk about economy, really what we're talking about is the ways that we choose to manage home. Movement Generation and the Climate Justice Alliance have a way of talking about the economy and the transition that I'll run through very quickly here. They note that any economy can be seen as having three main pillars. The way we use resources, the way we use labor and work towards a purpose that is determined by a worldview and that is implemented through a system of governance. These organizations, which are embedded in social justice work and racial justice work and gender justice, climate justice, the way they frame this is provocative but interesting. They talk about the current economy, the economy we have now, as an extractive economy in which resources are extracted, dig, burn, and dump. Labor is basically exploited, and the purpose, the main purpose, is the enclosure of wealth and power. And the worldview that allows this to happen, and the governance system that help to make it happen also. And you can put different words in here, but the words they use are things like patriarchy, consumerism, colonial mindsets. In the US, they would talk about white supremacy. That helps form a worldview. And I think especially we would agree about patriarchy and consumerism as having an important determining factor on how we use resources and work to what end. And then they talk about the governance system being basically militarism in that it's enforced. When people resist, it's enforced by the police or it's enforced by the military. And so they talk about the economy, this extractive economy, as a banks and tanks economy. Banks because it's financialized towards the purpose of accumulating wealth, and tanks because it's enforced. And so the work that they do and the way they conceive of the work is to transition from an extractive economy to an economy in which resources are regenerated, work is cooperative, and the purpose is ecological and social well-being. And this is interesting to me because I think every one of us in this room share the notion of our main goal being societal, ecological, and social well-being. So then the question becomes, can we do this within the logic of an extractive economy, or do we need to move to a regenerative economy? Sometimes they talk about this as a living economy, in which the worldview tends more towards sacredness and caring, and the governance system is deep democracy. So that's the way they approach this. This is a complicated picture that I won't go into too many details, but it's a way to look at how we move from stopping the bad, building the new, moving from the extractive economy to the living economy. The part in the middle, which I guess you can see, change the rules, is about governance, but then divesting from the extractive economy and reinvesting and feeding and growing the living economy is what I just want to mention in a little bit more details pertinent to philanthropy. So they've got these notions that I think many of us would share, that they talk about a values filter that helps us determine how we should invest both our grant-making resources and also our core financial wealth. And you can see some of the ways that would help us to divest from their power and reinvest in our power, as they would say at Movement Generation and the Climate Justice Alliance. This gets back to what I was saying before. This is a group in Richmond, California that's part of the Climate Justice Alliance. They've taken this basic frame, changed the story, changed the rules, organized to end the bad, starve and stop the extractive economy to build the new by organizing a movement of movements. But what I really like about this, and what I just want to spend a minute talking about here, is what I mentioned earlier, that if you take the individual projects that are cited underneath here, and again, you maybe can't see them very well, but each one of these projects, developing under Changing the Story, developing leadership to provide political education, or under Organizing to End the Bad, stopping healthcare cuts. These are transactional projects in many ways. These are projects that help people in the here and now. One by one, they're good projects that do good things that are not necessarily transformational, but one of the things that makes them more transformational is that all of these groups have come together. This is maybe about 20 community organizations in the Richmond, California area north of San Francisco. They've come together into an integrated plan where they see how all of these interrelated parts add up to more than the individual parts themselves. And so I think that this gives some good lessons for us in our grant making. We don't necessarily have to fund all aspects of the transformation, but by being more clearly conscious about how the work that we are funding is contributing to a long-term vision of change can be really important. One thing I should also mention about Edge Funders Alliance, and apologies to those of you who are in Australia and heard this already, or maybe at IFIP I said it as well, is that the theory of change that we use at Edge Funders is not a very sophisticated one, but as I like to say, it's the only one we've got, so we're kind of stuck with it for now. We talk about our work almost kind of with the analogy of a mapping app, like a Google mapping app. And the way to think about that is that when you want to find something locally, a local shop or a local restaurant, you zoom down with your mapping app to find that local thing. And all of the work that is being done around the world is local for the most part. Much of it is local. Most of the funding that we do is local. Funders tend to be, grant makers tend to be fairly zoomed down in the sense of being focused on a geographic area, but also often zoom down in a technical area of expertise or a funding silo. And so we see one of the roles of Edge Funders Alliance is to provide that function of zooming out. When you want to see the whole city block and not just the restaurant, or when you want to see the cityscape itself, or when you want to see the whole continent, or you want to see beyond the horizon, you zoom out. And at Edge, we like to think of Edge as a space for that zooming out process so that we can help funders to come up out of the day-to-day work that we're doing, to see the importance of the global connections, the importance of having a systemic analysis and critique, the importance of the role of the grassroots organizing sector in all of this work, so that then when we zoom back down with this higher consciousness, we may be more prone to moving in ways that are more transformational rather than transactional. So really to conclude, if we agree that transition is inevitable, but a just transition must be worked for, and to return to this theme of transformational philanthropy, it's important to distinguish between what we could think of as reformist reforms that help people in the short term, but that don't get at underlying problems, versus more radical reforms which attempt to get at root causes. And while funders don't necessarily need to change everything we do, it can be important to think about the broader global and systemic context for what we want to accomplish through that zooming out process. And then so just to conclude, if we agree that in order to resource change for world in transition, we must move from from an extractive economy to regeneration. And if we need to move from one logic to another, and that time is really of the essence, we also need to think about reorganizing philanthropy to support groups here in New Zealand and around the world who are helping us fundamentally rethink our management of this one and only home that we have. Thank you very much. I've got this here.
Thank you, Mark. We have time for just a little bit of time, and we do have one question. I mentioned before about Make Today Tomorrow and wishing that today was yesterday. I omitted to mention before Mark's speech to remind you about we do have the facility for questions, but one of you was onto it and they have asked a question. It's Annette Colpin. Where does Indigenous wisdom fit in the transition?
You know, I would not answer that question. I would turn that over to our Māori and other Indigenous friends to talk about that. But I think what I've been struck by here is We just had our conference in Barcelona, and it was around this theme of reorganizing power, and the final plenary was on reorganizing philanthropy for systems change. And we brought funders and movement partners together into 7 what we call engagement labs. These are 3 days of deep dive discussions on broad themes. And we asked everybody to try to imagine what systemic change looks like in their area of work. And then in some ways to build back from that utopia, to build back and think about what are some of the organizations they know of, some of the initiatives they know of around the world that are more transformational and not just transactional, and what characteristics they would ascribe to those movements, what makes them think that that kind of work is transformational and leading to deeper change. And then to talk about how philanthropy can be more supportive of that work. And so certainly when I came here and I started hearing in the different spaces I was in and having different conversations about the culture that exists here of really not only looking back 50 years or more, but looking forward. I think there was a screenshot yesterday that talked about our Vision 2050. I mean, that was very inspiring because I understand and see that here, and I think this is true of indigenous communities around the world, it's more natural in some ways than it is for many of us to think really about the long term, to envision the kind of society we want, the kind of communities we want. One of the things that distinguishes, in many ways, campaigning, there are some fantastic groups around the world. We work with many of them that do short-term campaigns. Campaigns are often fairly limited, and they're trying to get at some very specific and often very, very important short-term change. But community-based organizations and indigenous communities certainly tend to come at this less about how do we make this particular change, or maybe I should say not only about how do we make this particular change, but how do we make changes along a path that will lead us to the kinds of communities we want to live in and the kind of societies we want to build. And I guess that's the way I would answer that question.
That's a very good answer. Thank you, Mark. Question from Robin Nicholas. Can you talk about an example of where this move has happened?
One example that I often think of is around food sovereignty. And I'm not sure if everybody is familiar with food sovereignty, but farmers groups and landless farmers, indigenous groups around the world have come together through probably what is the largest movement in the world called La Via Campesina. They're in almost every country around the world. They have millions of members in Brazil alone, the MST, the Landless Peoples Movement, but they're everywhere. And I know that there's some great food sovereignty work being done in Maori communities here. And the way I often talk about food sovereignty is a long-term vision that's being implemented now, but it's a long-term change. As you get closer to food sovereignty, the nature of your relationship to food production, to food consumption, to land changes. It moves from that extractive economy to a more regenerative economy. But then, and because La Via Campesina has literally hundreds, I think they claim around 200 million members around the world. They're all over. There are 3 organizations and networks in the US that are part of La Via Campesina, and they're everywhere. Because they have that capacity, they're able to do advocacy work at the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. They are very present in the climate COPs, the climate negotiations, and the WTO negotiations, so they can advocate at various levels with governments around food sovereignty. They also have the capacity to do trainings around the world. I think at any one time they're running something like 30 agroecological trainings in different parts of the world. But then what I also say about La Via Campesina is that the individual organizations that are members of associations, that are members of federations, that are members of La Via Campesina, in the day-to-day work they do the work that any association does. They work very hard to improve the lives today of their partners, of their members. So I say, for example, an MST group in Brazil, if they've taken over land, they're figuring out how to get crops to market. They're figuring out how to, when the truck breaks down, how to fix the truck. They take over land there and they build a school and they think, damn, now how do we get teachers in here? So they're dealing with all of the day-to-day problems within the system as it is. But because they have this vision of food sovereignty and they're working towards it very, very thoughtfully and in a very committed way, the things that they do day to day to improve people's lives are more likely to be those more radical reforms, those reforms that tend towards the root causes of the problems they're addressing. And so I think the food sovereignty movement is one good example of that kind of work.
Thank you, Mark. And Michelle, that may have answered your question about the transition from extractive economies to regenerative economies.
There was just, at our conference last week, I'm trying to remember, I think it was someone, we were in Barcelona, which is an amazing city that's been undergoing all kinds of changes. There are fantastic groups there, and I think it was somebody from Barcelona who talked about, and I always have a hard time pronouncing the word chrysalis?
I have problems with pronunciation too.
Yes, I know. But they had this beautiful image of it's not like the good old days. I'm old enough to remember the good old days when we thought, you know, the revolution was going to be tomorrow, and the day after the revolution everything would be perfect. We'd be done with patriarchy, racism, and all the other bad things. Of course, that's not the way it's going to be. But this notion of building within the system as it is, and then having that accumulate and replicate, and eventually these beautiful butterflies coming out of the extractive economy. We see elements of and certainly here as well, elements of the regenerative living economy being enacted. There are systemic alternatives all over the world. How do we accelerate those, support those, understand those, help make them more visible, and bring whatever resources we can to them?
Thank you, Mark. We have had a number of questions and we're not going to have the time to be able to get to them all, but one final question, it's from Cheryl Spain. Do any of your funders who made their money through the extractive economy now have to balance those values with the regenerative economy they now want to support? And any examples?
Yes. So many of you know, I think, the Divest Invest movement, which is a very important movement and actually championed in the US by someone who just left our board, Ellen Dorsey, with the Wallace Global Fund. And the Divest Invest movement, for those that you don't know, it started as a student movement. It had been modeled on the US anti-apartheid movements in the US. Because the US government at that time, the Reagan government, was supporting the apartheid regime, students advocated for their universities to pull their funding out of companies that were in South Africa. So modeled on that, the notion started on campuses, but it spread into virtually all sectors now, including pension funds. And the idea basically is to divest from the carbon economy, from the oil companies and the coal companies, et cetera, and to reinvest in the green economy. The question that you asked, in some ways, what is being proposed through these models is to go deeper than that, to not divest from the carbon economy only, to reinvest in, to be perhaps a bit cynical at times, a slightly greener version of the extractive economy, but to divest from the extractive economy and invest in building this new economy. And out of our conference last year, this is a small project right now, but I think it will grow. About 6, 7, I think now 8 funders came together with movement partners, and they formed a project that is called Shake the Foundations. And it's an initiative that is working very, very thoughtfully on doing this. And not all foundations can do this, and even legally not all foundations can do this, but they're talking about how to transfer power from the funding institutions to communities, how to invest in worker co-ops, and not just any worker co-ops, but worker co-ops that really are consciously building the new as we have it here. So there's a lot of work going around there to thinking about how we make philanthropy not only transparent, but deeply, deeply accountable to the communities that it serves, that we serve. And how to really think about using those resources, which absolutely are a product of the extractive process, we all know, using them to support the new work that needs to be done. I think it was at IFIP, somebody talked about this book that was written, an anthology that came together, I think in around 2005, called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. And I think we certainly all know that the revolution will not be funded, and I'm not sure what kind of a revolution we need, but I think that there are a lot of resources that can be used in lots of very creative ways by all of us to help support these long-term movements for deeper systemic change. And again, just to remind ourselves, it's not as though we can choose whether or not we are going to transition into a very different economy and very different societies over the next 20, 30, 40 years. That transition really is happening, driven by technology, driven by all kinds of things. how do we use some of our resources to help push it along a pathway that'll get us to the more positive kinds of societies that we want.
Thank you very much, Mark. I mean, it seems to me that the Edge Funders Alliance is looking to fund the revolution in a way, and it's just listening to your talk this morning, I couldn't help but think of the Apollo space program, actually, and how they pushed the edge and pushed the boundaries into new frontiers, and it feels like the Edge Funders Alliance and the work that you're engaged in is doing just that. I also was reminded of the wise words of Jenny Gill. Where is Jenny? She's not here, she's celebrating her win. Oh, you are here, Jenny. Congratulations on your very well-deserved award last night, but one of the things that Jenny often hears, one of the things we often hear Jenny say is that philanthropy can be the venture capital of social change. And I think if we think about that in an investment portfolio type of context, a lot of us, our work, majority of it has to be in the sort of the cash and the bonds area of the portfolio, a bit safer, but there is opportunity to diversify a bit of our grants portfolio into that venture capital space, and the Edge Alliance is certainly looking to do that. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank Mark Randazzo. Thanks, Mark. Just wait here, I'll get the wrong way.
And again, we would love to have some members in the Edge Funders Alliance from Australia and New Zealand, so please join us.
Mark.
Yes, ma'am.
On behalf of the Philanthropy New Zealand Board, and I'd just like to share this saying with you. Ko te pai tāwhiti, whaia kia tata, ko te pai tata, whakamaua kia tina. Seek out the distant horizons and pull them closer. Hold steadfast to the ones that you have already attained.
That's perfect. Thank you. I'm gonna kiss you. Now your way. That was the French way. Let's start with the French way. Thank you.